Welcome, 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 Pixel Poppers. My name is Jordan. If you didn't know, I've been the sessions manager for PixelPop 2019, and we are officially halfway through the second day of PixelPop 2019, and I'm really sad. Because that means that we're really close to being done, but we're not quite done yet. We have a beautiful talk from Johnnemann Nordhagen called The American Story. The American Story, addressing serious topics and where the water tastes like wine. Johnnemann is a 16-year veteran of the game industry. He has worked as a QA tester in Sony's research and development department on the BioShock series at 2K Marin, and was the co-founder of the Fullbyte Company and the sole programmer on Gone Home. I love Gone Home. He founded Dim Bulb Games and headed development of Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, released in February 2018, and I'd like to welcome Johnnemann.
Hi, folks. Thanks for coming, and thanks to PixelPop for having me here. This is my first time here at PixelPop, but Where the Water Tastes Like Wine actually showed here last year, so I get to kind of catch up with my game now. It's great. So I think Jordan did a good job introducing me. I don't need to really go through this slide at all. All this information was covered. But what I do want to talk about is this game. In February of 2018, Dim Bulb Games, which is mostly me, shipped Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. And earlier in that year, I was invited to speak at Caltech about the process of making that game. The organizer there asked me a really interesting question. You chose to make a video game to tackle some really deep and profound issues. Why make a game about that sort of thing? And I think that's a really interesting question. It's a better question, I think, than can games handle serious things or are games political? Because the answer to both of those is obviously yes, they can. But why a game is a much more fruitful topic for discussion. Before I get to that, let me go a little into background on the game if you haven't seen anything about it already. It's a game about spreading folktales around a fantastical United States set most firmly in the Great Depression era, the heyday of riding the rails around the country. It's inspired in large part by American roots music, folk, bluegrass, blues, jazz, both the world described in those sorts of songs, about down-on-their-luck gamblers, meeting the devil at the crossroads, being beaten down by the bosses, and the social fabric that folk songs and stories are a part of, where one person would sing a song, another would learn it and play it on down the road, adding their own little pieces to the music and to the tale it tells. In fact, that's where the title comes from. It's a line from an old song, or perhaps just an old folk saying. You can hear it in songs, like Going Up the Country by Canned Heat, Going Down the Road Feeling Bad by the Grateful Dead, Blowing Down This Old Dusty Road by Woody Guthrie, Lonesome Road Blues, or older songs with no names. You can read the phrase in Sometimes a Great Notion by Ken Kesey, or Mules and Men by Zora Neale Hurston. No one's really sure where it originates, but I like the idea and the fact that it's passed from voice to voice with no owners. I have a quick trailer for the game here to give you more of an idea. This was really loud earlier, so I apologize if I blow out anyone's eardrums.
This land is built on stories. It's one big story, America is, woven of many small ones. Songs and myths and legends start somewhere with a seed. As they're told and retold and passed around, they grow and change to become the stories we know. Well, I gotta find. Wander the land, explore, meet people, gather stories and spread and share them. The most important stories are the true ones, the ones people will tell you about their own lives. I hope you find what you're looking for.
All right. Thanks. I love that trailer. It still gives me shivers up my spine to see that. I've seen it a billion times now, of course, but it's great. And that was Sting narrating that, by the way. It was a secret at the time, so he's not credited in the video, but just, I don't know, also another weird thing. But anyway, so in the fiction of the game, the player's been compelled to a task. They lost a bet, which is why you should never play poker with mysterious strangers. And now the player has a job. They're the personification of folklore. They're the thing that moves stories from place to place, that carries the threads of these tales around and ensures that they grow. The way that they do this is by having these little adventures. We call them vignettes. You can see one up here right now. They get to choose their path through an encounter, but the choices don't change much about the character. Instead, they determine what sort of story they'll get out of it. So perhaps one choice makes it a love story, while another makes it a tragedy. The player can take these stories, and when they meet one of the game's 16 characters, they can tell this story to them, and in return, they'll be told a piece of that character's story. So if they tell a love story, they'll hear back a piece of the character's life story on the subject of love. The characters are a diverse group of drifters and travelers. The only thing in common between them is that they're on the road, and they're looking for something in the metaphorical wasteland of the Great Depression, United States. I want to refresh your memory on the Great Depression and this era of US history. We're talking about the period from the 1920s to the 1940s, roughly. A few short years before, the Wild West was over. The spread of settlers westward with their crops and barbed wire put an end to the era of the cowboy and the open range. The indigenous people of the continent were brutally suppressed, killed or relocated to lands that nobody wanted. The rail network spread all over the US, connecting everywhere in relatively short, easy journeys, even in luxury. The 20s was a time of glittering excess, and then the crash in 1929 put an end to all that and started the Great Depression in the US. Very high economic inequality, unmatched until today, combined with a lack of regulation, especially over financial markets, set up the stage for a horrible economic catastrophe. The economic collapse and lack of jobs was exacerbated by the Dust Bowl, an environmental disaster caused by extended drought that hit the middle of the country and farming techniques that ruined the land. Human-caused climate change. Banks failed in the wake of speculation, and protectionist policies hastened the decline. Many Americans lost their homes to predatory mortgages and ended up homeless. They congregated in shanty towns that became known as Hoovervilles after Herbert Hoover, the president at the time. During this period, there were up to 2 million homeless people wandering the country as hobos. Industrial production fell 45%, and starvation and disease were rampant. Hoover was eventually replaced by Roosevelt, who instituted giant infrastructure and government-supported employment programs that saved the country, building enduring projects such as bridges and dams that still stand today. He also instituted major regulations, protecting the banks from their own greed and instituting social safety nets, such as the Social Security Administration, setting minimums for wages and prices, and encouraging the formation of unions to increase the purchasing power of the working class. Now, Roosevelt was by no means perfect, but this move saved the country and improved countless lives. However, many people in the country considered it evil, for it seemed like a move in the direction of socialism. Some of these programs would be destroyed almost immediately. Others stood until very recently. That's the world in which this game takes place, and a little about the culture and history that we find ourselves in. The title, Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, has other meanings beyond the ones I already went over, though. The game is about the American dream and about chasing something that's impossible to find, or at least impossible to find in the form you're looking for. That's the central theme of the narrative, and as you saw in the trailer, you're introduced to your mission by this mysterious character who tells you that America is made up of stories, that it's one big story, woven of lots of small ones that we tell each other about who we are and what we stand for. He wants you to go find the true stories, the ones that have been overlooked, and spread those around. Because, as he says, isn't a tarnished and battered truth better than a shining lie? And these stories do confront some difficult truths. The characters and systems in the game talk about things like racism, national identity, inequality, historical atrocities, politics, capitalism, love, fear, faith, war, family, and death. So, why take on those subjects in a video game, of all things? Well, remember I told you about the themes of the game and the main mission of the player character. One of the ways we spread and reaffirm our values is by telling stories about them. Stories are really important. We tell stories about a lot of things. You can look back at fairy tales, at the classic Grimm tales, and see some of the values that they were expressing or reaffirming. There's a lot of don't talk to strangers, tell the truth, obey your parents, and differences are something to be frightened of. Further back, you can look at biblical parables or Aesop's tales. We can see what the ancient Greeks considered heroic qualities by looking at what deeds they ascribed to their heroes. But of course, we're still doing this today. Martin Luther King Jr. has been accepted as one of America's heroes. He even has a federal holiday dedicated to his memory. We tell stories about MLK, nonviolent resistance, peaceful marching, civil rights, all great things, definitely. But most of us probably never heard, at least not in grade school, that MLK was a socialist, that he fought hard against the Vietnam War, that he called the US government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. Those things are part of his story too, but they're in danger of being lost as we try to adapt the story of one of our heroes to include the traits we find heroic and elide the rest. We do this with a lot of things. We tell each other that Obama was born in Kenya or in Hawaii. The founding fathers were Christian, or they weren't. Dropping the atomic bomb on Japan was the only way to end the war, or it was an unnecessary show of brutal force. In many ways, the divisions in this country are around the stories that we tell to each other and that we believe. Many of the stories in the game are pieces of American history that don't normally get told as part of our great cultural history. Others are different angles on the same tales. In the game, we talk about the coal mine wars of the early 20th century, when the US Army and hired guns fought against striking miners. We tell the story of the Long Walk of the Navajo, when the US government forcibly relocated an entire people from their land. We tell the story of the Bonus Army, when World War veterans marched on Washington to demand their bonus pay and were met by General MacArthur's tanks. We tell the story of the Pullman Porters, the first black union in the US, and the spread of black culture and people across the country it enabled. None of these are stories we often tell, because they don't really fit our vision of this country. And so, by making this game, we're spreading those stories. Just as the player character walks the land, hearing and telling stories and passing them through the country, we're doing the same thing with this game, exposing these stories to an audience that may not have heard them before, or who have never heard them from this point of view before. Because one of the things this game does is that each character you meet and each story you hear was written by a different person. These writers are telling stories from their backgrounds, tales that resonate with them and come from their truth. And a game, being a modern medium for telling stories, provides a way for each of them to tell their tale. Well, striking miners, ignored veterans, barren farms, racial strife, death and despair, that doesn't sound like a very fun game, does it? What is fun about the Great Depression? So first, I want to challenge the assumption that a game needs to be fun. I assume that because you're all here at PixelPop, I'm preaching to the choir, but games are art, and art isn't solely for our enjoyment. In fact, some of the best art challenges us and makes us uncomfortable. There are many great games that aren't fun, just as there are many movies that aren't feel-good romps. This game is at least hopefully somewhat enjoyable, though. It wasn't always that way. When I first set out to create this game, I wanted it to be thoroughly depressing. I wanted it to be unrelenting, difficult to make progress within, and for the game's systems to rebuff the player at every turn. You would slowly starve, never have any money or food, get beaten up by the cops regularly. You would die, often, and you would feel in your bones the misery of existing as a poor vagrant in the worst hard times the US had ever seen. Discussions of challenge in video games often focus on that sort of thing, how hard it is to survive or to win. It comes from an era when that was all that games offered, a test of skill against a designer and a machine, and an eventual victory if you mastered the game. These days, if you ask someone, what's the most challenging game you've played, they might say something like Dark Souls or Cuphead, a game that depends on skill mastery, reflexes, memorization of patterns. But if you ask someone, what's the most challenging film you've seen, or what's the most challenging book you've read, you get very different answers. We talk about challenge in the realm of art as a different sort of thing than skill mastery. You don't need reflexes to enjoy a challenging work of art. Sure, sometimes you might have people who brag about the length of books they've read, but, that's sort of sad. Instead, challenge in these works comes on other axes. A work might be emotionally challenging, something that makes you feel despair or loss or existential angst. It might be intellectually challenging, something that benefits most from multiple deep reads from different perspectives, gleaning all the layers of meaning that the creator put in. We don't talk about that kind of challenge very often in games, and I think we should. And while making this game, I decided that was the type of challenge I wanted the game to have. I wanted the stories to be emotionally challenging. It's hard to hear a DNA writer and character tell you what the long walk was like. It's hard to hear the pain and heartbreak in a beat poet's tale of unrequited love. I wanted the stories to be intellectually challenging. for players to read into the metaphors and allusions in the tale of Althea, who sells her soul to the devil at the crossroads to be the best blues musician in the world. To revel in the gorgeous writing and unfolding story of Bertha, the Oklahoma Dust Bowl refugee. I wanted this partly because that's the sort of challenge that appeals to me these days. I still enjoy a Super Meat Boy or a Cuphead, but I don't have the time or inclination to develop that level of mastery anymore. But I also wanted it because I think it's important that games offer that sort of challenge. I think for the medium to move forward and expand its boundaries, we need to embrace and explore what games can do with this. I still think there's a game that could be the mechanically challenging survival mode version of Where the Water Tastes Like Wine. Something like Cart Life, something that puts the player into real-world systems to let them see how crushing and inescapable and filled with catch-22s they are. But that approach was at odds with wanting the player to primarily appreciate the gorgeous writing of the incredibly talented authors, and the two parts of that game could not coexist. So instead, we pulled in more of the American folklore aspect. The US that the player wanders across is not just a barren wasteland of misery. The player can encounter Casey Jones, John Henry, Sasquatch, the Headless Horseman, Pecos Bill, or the devil himself. And then there are stories made up from whole cloth. The violin of Louise Ames, the two brothers reunited after 30 years apart, the mysterious light by the shore, the bootlegging women, and many, many more. Over 200 unique stories with branching paths and outcomes to fascinate and entertain the player. For this game, that approach works much better than the bleak, depressing, hostile, and repellent atmosphere I had initially tried to create. And I think that part of the reason why harkens back to why stories are such a good vehicle for communicating our values. We're sucked into the world of the story, pulled along by the tale, and immersed in the journey. Don't talk to strangers is easy to say, but it may not have the pull of Little Red Riding Hood. And even if the story is sad or scary, for a little while, we're lost in it, transported to a different world. That's the power of storytelling. And that's ultimately the answer to the question posed at the start of this talk. Why make a game about these things? Because the game could tell a story in an effective way, and in fact, bring the player in and give the player the tools to tell this story themselves. The act of playing the game makes you a participant in spreading these stories, even while the game itself is bringing the stories to you. I don't think that another approach or another medium would have worked as well as this did. Games are a modern method of storytelling, but they're more than that too. With games, we make the player complicit in whatever we ask the characters to do. I don't know that this is an argument to gamify everything or to make traditional capital S serious games. But I hope that by letting the player be a part of spreading the stories in Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, I encourage them to learn these stories themselves and maybe even share them with others in the manner of folk culture from time immemorial. Thank you. I think that I have a couple minutes left, so if there are any questions, I could definitely take a question or two. And if not, that's fine. I just get to go early. Yes?
So you brought on a number of writers. What was the sort of criteria for were you looking for specific things in their writing, or was it just that, hey, we need writers?
They were all, pretty much all people that I knew and admired their work already. There's some really amazing writers in here. Let me see if I can go back to the slide with everyone's names listed. Yeah, here we are. So these are the character writers, but you can see people in there like Gita Jackson and Austin Walker and Lee Alexander, Emily Short, just an amazing ton of incredibly talented writers. So that was the first criteria, obviously, but I also wanted to get people who are comfortable about writing this, comfortable writing about the sort of things that I wanted to ask them to write about, right? So, you know, I wanted people who could say, like, yes, I'm comfortable telling the story of the Long Walk of the Navajo from that perspective. And yeah, does that answer your question? Great. Anyone else? Probably one more. Oh, no, never mind. Time up, says the sign. Thank you all very much.